No one knows exactly what causes multiple sclerosis. It's believed to be due to a complicated interplay between genetic and environmental factors, but I'm relatively confident that it has something to do with modern society, and changes in our environment and lifestyle are contributing significantly to causing MS, and if you were born a few thousand years ago, you probably wouldn't have developed it, and I'll give you 10 reasons why, citations below. Number 1. MS was not described in the ancient world. Many neurological diseases are clearly described in ancient literature, but MS is notably absent. The first clear report of someone with symptoms consistent with MS is Lidwina the Virgin, born in 1380, who had relapsing symptoms of vision loss, facial pain, and paralysis, likely consistent with relapsing MS. She's now known as the modern Catholic patron saint of ice skating. However, there are no other clear descriptions of MS prior to that. The prevalence of MS in the United States is 1 in 500. If it were that common back then, surely there would be other descriptions. Yes, it's hard to diagnose MS without MRI scans and an understanding of the neurological exam, but surely there would at least be descriptions of neurological symptoms consistent with MS and prominent individuals who coincidentally developed MS, but it seems to be strikingly absent. Number 2, the variation in prevalence of MS throughout the globe. This map shows the approximate risk of MS I compiled from different studies throughout the world, and you can see it varies tremendously. In Southern California, where I am, it's about 1 in 420, but in Eastern Sub-Saharan Africa, it's only 1 in 30,000. And by the way, where I am, Black people and people of European descent have roughly equal risk of MS, so it may not just be genetic. It seems that people living a more modern life have a greater risk of MS. Also, migration studies suggest that if you migrate from a low-risk area to a higher-risk area prior to your teenage years, you acquire the higher risk in the new area, suggesting that it's a lifestyle change, not just a genetic difference that determines the risk of MS. Number 3, MS is becoming more common. For instance, in Finland in 1974, the risk of MS was only 1 in 4,100, but in 2021, it was 1 in 414, a tenfold increase in the risk. Yes, in 1974, there were no MRI scans, but do you really think that in a country with a well-established medical system, 90% of people with a serious neurological disease were undiagnosed? To me, it seems unlikely. More likely, some of the increase in prevalence is genuine and due to changes in our culture. In Japan, MS used to be very rare, but is increasingly recognized and diagnosed, and the prevalence is increasing linearly. And again, in the year 2000, the idea that Japanese neurologists didn't know what MS was is ludicrous and insulting. In Iran, between 2006 and 2014, the risk of MS went from 1 in 19,000 to 1 in 900, and more than 20-fold increase. Number 4, parasite infections are inversely linked to the risk of MS. In areas of the world where there's the greatest risk of infection with parasites, the risk of MS is actually lower. It's thought that parasites have a function in regulating the immune system. Of course, as we modernize, we're sort of cleaner. We don't walk around barefoot as much, we have better water purification, and we don't get as many parasite infections, which is good, but it may have the unintended consequence of increasing the risk of autoimmune disease. It turns out parasite infections cause a shift in the T helper cells, causing them to shift towards a profile called the Th2 profile, similar to the effect of beta interferons, drugs which treat multiple sclerosis, and that may be why there's an increase in risk with low parasite exposure. There's even this randomized trial published in JAMA, where people with MS were intentionally infected with hookworms, and it actually reduced relapses by about 50%, though the primary outcome of the trial was MRI activity where there was no difference. Obviously, this is not a practical treatment of MS, but it's an interesting proof of concept. Number 5, sunlight. It's well known that low sunlight exposure is linked to MS. Here's a graph showing latitude versus the risk of MS. As you go further from the equator, there's a greater chance of getting MS. This is also true within countries. In the United States, you can see there's a clear latitude latitude effect on the prevalence of MS. Even in China, where MS is very rare, there's still this latitude phenomenon. Sunlight seems to suppress multiple sclerosis. There are a lot of theories on why this may be the case. It turns out that ultraviolet exposure has effects on CD25 positive or suppressor T cells and may have a function in regulating the immune system. But if you think about it, in modern society, we get much less sunlight exposure than our ancestors. Clothing covers 90% of our body, and we spend so much time indoors. Someone living in the ancient world in Europe may have had just as much ultraviolet radiation exposure as someone living in modern times near the equator. People living near the equator are living more like our ancestors in terms of UV exposure. Number 6, this chart shows the wealth of different regions on Earth and the prevalence of MS, and there's a very clear correlation. This map shows the prosperity index versus prevalence of MS, and again, the correlation is striking. As we become wealthier, we live less and less like our ancestors. We live a totally different life in terms of cleanliness, hygiene, sunlight exposure, diet, and many factors I may not even be considering. Yes, there are many confounders here, but the strong correlation is striking. Number 7, it's not just MS. The prevalence of all autoimmune diseases seems to be increasing. This graph shows the prevalence per 100,000, and you can see that various autoimmune diseases are becoming more common. And a lot of these, like type 1 diabetes and psoriasis, don't really require expensive or rare diagnostic equipment to assist in making the diagnosis. It seems that some of these diseases have a shared underlying immunopathologic mechanism and are actually associated with each other. For instance, MS is well known to be associated with uveitis. So there's probably something that's going on that's increasing all of these diseases at once. Number 8, Epstein-Barr virus. EBV, the virus which causes mononucleosis, glandular fever, is known to be linked with MS, with virtually 100% of people with MS testing positive to antibodies against EBV, implying prior infection. But almost everyone gets EBV anyway at some point, regardless of whether or not they have MS. People who get symptoms, who get clinical mono, have roughly double the risk of MS. But this study looks at when people get mono. For low prevalence areas like Greenland and Uganda, at the time the study was done, in Greenland MS was rare, people tend to get it earlier in life. But in higher prevalence areas like Denmark and Pennsylvania, some people get it a little bit later, where it's more likely to cause symptoms, more likely to cause infectious mononucleosis, and that has been linked to a higher risk of MS in many other studies. So there must be something about modern society that causes some people to get EBV infection later on, which may increase the risk of it causing MS. Number 9, the microbiome, the microorganisms in our gastrointestinal tract. This seems to have an increasingly recognized influence on human disease. The microbiome could influence the way our immune system functions through complicated mechanisms, and it's changing because our diet is changing, we have more exposure to antibiotics, and a lot of different factors. Studies on people with MS show that their microbiome, on average, is different from the general population. For instance, they have less Prevotella, whereas studies on hunter-gatherer populations suggest that they actually have more Prevotella compared to humans living in developed societies, suggesting that changes in the microbiome caused by other lifestyle factors could be increasing the risk of MS. Number 10, it can't be genetic. The things that I'm describing, the wide range in prevalence of MS throughout the world, the increase in the risk of MS, could not plausibly be explained by genetic changes. Even though humans as a species have changed a lot in the last few thousand years, our genes are changing much more slowly, and the genes that are linked to risk of MS are really ancient genes which have been around for a long time. For instance, the allele most linked to risk of MS, HLA-DRB1 1501, if you have 2 copies of this allele or gene version, you have an 8-fold increased risk of MS compared to someone with no copies of this allele, yet it's an ancient gene. It's widely distributed throughout the world, including in regions of the world with very low risk of MS, so it can't be changes in genetics that explain these differences. It must either be difference in environment or possibly increased detection. So do you agree with my conclusion that society is essentially causing MS, or at least making it much more common? Do you think it's caused by the factors I mentioned, or maybe something I'm not even considering? Or am I totally off base, and is it just increased recognition and diagnosis? I'd love to know your thoughts in the notes below, and let me know if you have ideas for other videos.